looking at the gluteal region, this is the posterior aspect of the thigh, but more so of the hip, right? Looking at the buttocks and gluteal region. Here we have two layers of muscles, not necessarily compartments here, but layers. We have an outer superficial layer, which includes the gluteus maximus. Everything we can see just on superficially looking at the region are going to include those structures. So the gluteus maximus, gluteus medius. Now, one of the best ways to differentiate gluteus maximus from gluteus medius is looking for its attachment to the iliac crest, okay? Gluteus medius goes all the way up to the iliac crest. Gluteus minimus, however, only goes part the way up. So this is gluteus minimus, and you have to take medius off to be able to see minimus, whereas you can see maximus and medius superficially, all right? Now, if we take those off and look at the deeper layer, we're going to see several different muscles that are found in the deep posterior region. These include the piriformis, okay, the piriformis up here. Then we have superior gemellus, obturator internus, inferior gemellus, quadrator femoris, and then we get right into the adductor magnus, okay? Now, interestingly, I think the best way to remember these muscles is to remember them together in that order. This is one of the best ways to help you differentiate them one from the other, but also just to know each of their locations as compared to the other. So the gluteus medius, immediately inferior to that is piriformis. Piriformis is sort of a wedge-shaped or triangle-shaped muscle going across to the greater trochanter of the femur. Then we have three muscles that are really slim, but sort of nestled together, tightly wedged together with each other. Superior gemellus, inferior gemellus, and then in between both of those, obturator internus, okay? So think about those three together. Superior gemellus, obturator internus, internus kind of meaning that it's in the middle of those two, and then inferior gemellus. Next, we have quadratus femoris. Quadratus femoris has four sides. This is what quadratus means. So think about the more square-shaped muscle being the quadratus femoris. All right. So that will be a good way to remember all five of these muscles, or if you want to include gluteus minimus as well, in that order. Let's look at them individually. So gluteus maximus, largest muscle of the gluteal region, heaviest and more coarse fibered muscle of the body. This is one of the most powerful muscles of our body. When we think about doing, weight-bearing exercises, calorie burning exercises, this is one of the best muscles to engage. Its main action is going to be raising the body from a seated position. So really important in extending the hip and raising the body, a really powerful muscle in that way. It's going to course from the spinous processes of the sacrum across onto the femur, and that will help indicate its action as well. If we look at some of the deeper muscles, so there are two other muscles associated with the gluteus maximus, gluteus medius, and then gluteus minimus. Okay. Now, these are also going to help in the action of gluteus maximus, but they also have separate actions that are going to help to antagonize. And so their actions are going to be less influential, less powerful, as we can probably tell by their size. And again, that little tip that I gave in terms of looking how far up the iliac crest the fibers insert will help you distinguish between medius and minimus. Next, going down that sequence of muscles that we described, here we have piriformis. Piriformis is going to be a really important landmark to where the sciatic nerve emerges. The sciatic nerve here, coming from the lumbosacral plexus, is going to emerge below the piriformis, but above the other four muscles that we described. Piriformis is also kind of pear-shaped or wedge-shaped, as we described, and it's going to be right inferior to gluteus minimus. The superior gemellus, obturator internus, inferior gemellus are the next in that order. They are not as easy to distinguish on a cadaver. So if you do happen to go in a lab at any point later on and try to look for these, they're very hard to distinguish from each other. They usually appear as one chunk of muscle, especially these three, but they are three different bands of muscle that have slightly different actions. Okay. You also might only see the tendons of these, so they kind of prominently have tendons as opposed to more of the muscle in other, as we'd see with other muscles. Below the obturator internus, we have the inferior gemellus, and then we have the quadratus femoris. If we look at the deepest layer here of the gluteal region, so quadratus femoris, again, that four-sided muscle going across to the femur. And so all of these muscles are going to help to act across the hip. Some of them will abduct the hip, some of them will adduct the hip, but they also help to stabilize the hip joint, especially when it comes to walking with our gait. Walking in our gait requires us to steady one hip as we lift the other foot off the ground. So the steadying of that alternate hip is really important for the balancing aspect of the gait. And all of these muscles we just described are going to help with that. Let's look at the posterior compartment. So this is going to include the hamstring muscles, collectively made up of three separate muscles, the semitendinosus, which is going to have a more prominent tendon, right? Think about that word tendinosus, here's semitendinosus. Then we have semimembranosus, which is deep to tendinosus. And then on the other side, the lateral aspect of the thigh posteriorly, we have the biceps femoris, okay? Biceps femoris actually has a long head and then a deeper short head that both insert onto the lateral tibia. Now, these are all going to originate from the ischial tuberosity, right? We talk about that ischial prominence that you sit on, part of the hip bone. They're going to span two joints. So kind of like some of the anterior muscles that we talked about, like the sartorius that span across two joints. They're going to bring about extension at the hip, but also flexion at the knee because they're crossing both joints. Let's look at them individually. So semitendinosus, right? Again, look for the tendon. The more prominent tendon and the more superficial muscle is going to be your semitendinosus, attaching onto the medial leg. Deep to that, we're going to find semimembranosus. So semimembranosus, okay, is going to be more muscular, more meaty, and it's going to be more medial and more deep to the semitendinosus. Then we have so we talk about membranosus again, deeper, much more of a muscular or a bulkier muscle as opposed to more tendon. And then also attaching medial, but just slightly deeper. Now, when we talk about these muscles, they're going to form the medial aspect of the popliteal fossa. So this little sort of diamond-shaped region here is called the popliteal fossa, and the borders of that space are the semitendinosus, but more so semimembranosus because it is more medial and it is deeper. The lateral aspect will be the long head of biceps femoris, and then we'll talk about the inferior aspects of that space, which will be formed by the gastrocnemius. Moving on to the biceps femoris, so the lateral hamstring muscles. Again, this has two heads. It has a more superficial long head going all the way down to the fibula. And then it has a deeper short head, which can be seen just a little bit from a more deeper dissection, right? But it's looking at the leg posteriorly, or the thigh, excuse me, I keep saying leg, the thigh posteriorly, we can only appreciate the biceps femoris long head. Okay, let's talk about the innervation here. So the sciatic nerve, longest nerve in the body, thickest nerve in the body, emerges below the piriformis, going to travel above the other four deep gluteal muscles. So above the superior gemellus, obturator internus, inferior gemellus, quadratus femoris, and then even passing more superficial to some of our adductors as well, going all the way down the thigh, passing at the popliteal fossa. Now, at the popliteal fossa, it's going to divide into its two smaller divisions. So the sciatic nerve is a really interesting nerve because it's actually formed by two smaller nerves that have just kind of been joined together. When they get to the popliteal fossa, they split off into their two separate parts. The tibial nerve crossing the popliteal fossa, traveling posteriorly and inferiorly to become the tibial nerve in the leg, right? Supplying the posterior leg. And then the common fibular, also called common peroneal, that is going to split off to the side and pass lateral, right, into the lateral compartment. And then it's going to divide into two smaller branches. It's going to divide into the deep fibular and the superficial fibular, all coming from that one common fibular. So we have a lot of sequential branching coming from that single sciatic nerve. First, we have the tibial and common fibular. Then from the common fibular, we have the superficial and we have the deep. So that's kind of an overview, but we'll talk about how they course differently and make their way down into the various compartments of the leg. Now, the popliteal fossa, so again, that diamond-shaped region formed by biceps femoris long head, semimembranosus, and then the cut surfaces here, we have the gastrocnemius heads. So the tibial nerve is the main structure that's passing through the popliteal fossa. It has already divided a bit more sort of superior here before it actually reaches the fossa. And then we have tibial traversing through the fossa and eventually into the leg, whereas common fibular divides off to the side and will wrap around the head of the fibular before inserting to the lateral aspects. Other structures found in the popliteal fossa are going to be the popliteal vessel, so popliteal artery and popliteal vein. Right? Now, interestingly, the popliteal vein and artery, as we mentioned earlier, are going to be the continuation of femoral vein and artery that are coming from the anterior thigh. Let's look at our lateral compartment muscles, right? So we talked about our anterior compartment muscles earlier. Let's shift gears here and talk about the lateral. Now, this includes two muscles, fibularis longus and fibularis brevis. Longus, as the name would imply, coming from the head of the fibula down onto the metatarsals here. And so fibularis longus, more superficial, longer, but also going to be more of the powerful muscle, the everter of the foot. Deep to that, fibularis brevis, much shorter, much more difficult to see on its own. You can see a little bit of that here. And as the name brevis would imply, it's going to be shorter, right? Deeper and shorter. And then notice how the two tendons of those muscles, again, coming down to attach onto the metatarsals, fibularis longus and brevis. So that will kind of give you an indicator of their action. They're going to move the lateral aspect of the foot outward as this tendon shortens to bring about eversion. Moving to the posterior compartment, right, we have the superficial layer and the deep layer. This is the biggest compartment of the leg. This has the biggest muscles and the most powerful muscles of the leg that are going to help bring about plantar flexion. So the most superficial being the gastrocnemius, very powerful muscle. Two large heads that are going to help form that popliteal fossa, but also the insertion of the gastrocnemius onto the calcaneus via the calcaneal tendon, right? This is also called the Achilles tendon, right? I'm sure we've heard of this very strong insertion or tendinous attachment to the calcaneus that helps to stabilize the gastrocnemius muscle. We're also going to find deep to that the tibialis posterior on the posterior aspect of the tibia, and then the flexor digitorum longus and flexor hallucis longus, which are going to oppose the actions of extensor digitorum longus and extensor hallucis longus. Remember, those anterior muscles help to bring about dorsiflexion, toes up, whereas these deep posterior muscles help to bring about plantar flexion, toes down. So as you would imagine, their insertion is going to be on the sole of the foot because they help to bring the toes inward or downward, as opposed to the anterior muscles, which run on the top of the foot. All right. They also help to bring about a little bit of inversion, especially when you think about your flexor digitorum longus, because it comes onto the medial aspect of the foot and then inserts onto the phalanx. Then that will help to bring about a little bit of inversion, right? Bringing the foot inward along with plantar flexion. Let's look at the gastrocnemius. So two large heads, the shared calcaneal tendon, and the most powerful and secure tendon in the body. And this is why we refer to the Achilles heel, right? The Achilles, because it's the most powerful, most secure tendon, if you injure someone's Achilles, you completely, destroy any of their movements. So it's kind of a vulnerable spot. And this is why we use it in that sort of analogy when we talk about that region. A very vulnerable once it's injured. Moving on to some of the deeper muscles, if we take the gastrocnemius away, we have the soleus and plantaris. Soleus being another large muscle underneath the gastrocnemius. This one is more so involved in things like our posture. Okay, because it's a deeper muscle, it's going to be more of a postural muscle, helping us to stand and walk for long hours or long periods. Whereas gastrocnemius is more of a powerful muscle with helping in actions like sprinting and running and flexion at the knee. Now, soleus and calcaneus will also, or excuse me, soleus and gastrocnemius will also share that common calcaneal tendon, and all three muscle or both muscles, all three heads, will insert onto the calcaneus. Now, plantaris, on the other hand, is a very long muscle, but it's mostly tendon. It's a very short muscle body proximal at the knee joint. Actually, the plantaris muscle helps to stabilize the knee joint. It's also going to help to unlock the knee joint, or excuse me, lock the knee joint or bring about flexion at the knee. So helping with locking of the knee joint. And that is going to have a long tendinous attachment that travels all the way down to insert onto the shared tibia with the other foot muscles, not the calcaneal tendon. So a separate tendon from the calcaneal tendon. Now, interestingly, the the plantaris muscle is absent in about 5 to 10% of the population. And it kind of reminds me of the palmaris longus. We talked about palmaris longus, a similar type of muscle in the forearm, right, which is kind of an analogous region in the upper limb, that has mostly tendon, very small muscle belly, and has sort of a varying appearance. It's present in some persons, absent in a percentage of the population, and it has a very small action. The plantaris muscle is sometimes used when we have things like valve replacements of the heart or other types of not prosthetic, but other types of replacements that are required where we need tendon or we need connective tissue. We can take it from this muscle because it doesn't have a really clear, separate or unique function. Let's go to some of the other deep muscles here. So tibialis posterior on the posterior aspect of the tibia, and then our two flexors, flexor digitorum longus, going all the way down to the 4 lateral digits to flex the 4 lateral digits, and then flexor hallucis longus on the lateral aspect, traveling around the medial aspect of the calcaneus to then insert onto the great toe and then bring about flexion of the great toe. So notice how tibialis posterior is sort of sandwiched in between those two flexors, one going to the great toe and then the medial going to the 4 lateral digits. So don't let the location of these muscles confuse you. Okay, that can be a little bit counterintuitive. The hallucis longus is on the lateral aspect, but it crosses to supply what you insert at the great toe. Digitorum longus is on the medial aspect, but it supplies, again, crossing to supply the lateral digits. Okay, so that can be a little bit reversed in terms of that order. Let's talk about the arteries here again. So we looked at how the femoral artery started at the thigh, at the inguinal region, traveled through this adductor hiatus, this opening in the adductor magnus, emerges on the posterior aspect to now become the popliteal artery. That is going to pass through the popliteal fossa along with the sciatic nerve, okay, and part of the tibial nerve as well, and the popliteal vein. Now, when uh, the popliteal arteries, excuse me, lost my voice there. When the popliteal artery gets across the popliteal fossa, it will now divide into the anterior tibial artery and the posterior tibial artery, and then that will further divide to give off the fibular artery. Okay, so anterior tibial is going to cross through this membrane. We talked about the interosseous membrane in the upper limb that helps to span across both of the forearm bones. In the leg, we have a similar interosseous membrane that spans across the leg bones. And so the anterior tibial artery will have to pierce that membrane in order to end up in the anterior compartment and supply all the anterior. The other two arteries are going to remain slightly more posterior, with the posterior tibial traveling down the back of the leg, supplying the posterior compartment, and then the fibular traveling lateral to supply the lateral compartment. So the immediate three branches of the popliteal artery are going to be divided according to the compartments that they supply. Posterior tibial to the posterior compartment, anterior tibial to the anterior compartment, fibular to the fibular compartment, or the lateral compartment. Let's look at the nerves. The nerves are going to take a similar sort of course. First, we have the tibial nerve staying medial and traveling down the back of the leg along with the posterior tibial. So those two together supply that compartment. Then we're going to have anterior tibial traveling to supply the anterior compartment. That is going to be traveling along with the deep fibular nerve, which is a branch of the common fibular. So here's our sciatic, here is the tibial, here's common fibular, and then common fibular further divides into superficial fibular and deep fibular. Superficial fibular supplies the lateral compartment along with the fibular artery. Deep fibular supplies the anterior compartment along with the anterior tibial artery. Okay. Now, lastly, in terms of looking at the sole of the foot, we have the plantar fascia. And the plantar fascia helps to maintain the foot arches, as well as just secure the foot, really important in things like our balance and gait because of that, securing the sole of the foot. Now, when this is inflamed, this can result in plantar fasciitis. And you may have experienced symptoms of this if you have this, which is when you put your foot on the ground, you get that aching sort of uncomfortable sensation at the sole of your foot, at the bottom of your foot, especially when you step down from an elevated position. When you step down onto a step or going downstairs, or you step down out of a car, things like that. So you get this sort of uncomfortable sensation or aching when the plantar fascia becomes inflamed, which is known as plantar fasciitis. All right, so here is the schematic that I showed or that I shared with the slides that we've kind of talked about several parts of this, but I think this is a nice study tool to just come, bring everything together and study in terms of how the single artery gives rise to all of the supply to the limb. So the femoral artery supplying the anterior thigh, it's going to give off immediately the deep artery or the profundus artery of the thigh, supplying the posterior and deep thigh. Then we have the popliteal fossa, right? Remember, the popliteal artery emerges through the popliteal fossa. It will then give off the anterior tibial, supplying the anterior compartment and the top of the foot, dorsum of the foot. The fibular compartment being supplied by the fibular artery, and then the posterior compartment being supplied by the posterior tibial artery. Now, it might be nice to also put the nerves with these because these are traveling with their accompanying nerve, okay? So femoral artery travels with the femoral nerve. Popliteal artery travels with the tibial nerve as it branches from the sciatic. Anterior tibial travels with the deep fibular nerve. Fibular artery travels with the superficial fibular nerve, and then posterior tibial travels with the tibial nerve as well. So think about how these are coursing through the various compartments with their associated nerve. And then here's a schematic for the nerves as well, starting with the sciatic. Remember, sciatic emerging below the piriformis, but above the other muscles, and then traveling posteriorly in the thigh. It's going to give the tibial, which goes straight down to supply the posterior leg and foot. And then the common fibular, which at the head of the fibula divides into superficial fibular supplying the lateral compartment and deep fibular supplying the anterior compartment and dorsum of the